Sam Raimi is a director that is known for creating some notoriously famous horror films like the Evil Dead movies and Drag Me to Hell, and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is said to have had some horror elements inside of the movie. Scott Derrickson wasn't able to fulfill them, but the MCU managed to pick up Sam Raimi and managed to see if they can let him do some of his charm within this movie. But have the horror elements been fulfilled for this movie? We're gonna go ahead and figure that out right now. Here's how this video is going to work. Right now, I have not seen the movie yet, but what I will be doing for now is give you guys 4 brackets that help describe every single detail on what needs to qualify as a scary movie and analyze this film to see if this movie meets those expectations. Now, after I get done analyzing one bracket, it will cut to me who has actually seen the movie and see if those qualifications have exceeded my expectations on the scary elements for the movie. So let's go ahead and get started with the first bracket. The first bracket we're going to analyze is how much suffering is endured within the movie. And the details that will help meet the expectations for this bracket are how much gore is in the movie, is there any torture, how dreadful can it feel, and how brutal can it get. All of these meet the criteria of how you could do suffering in a film, because without suffering, there isn't really much of a point in calling it a scary film. So let's go ahead and skip to me, who has actually seen the film, and see if these 4 details have met and have been qualified for the suffering rating. Okay, got back from seeing Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Time to discuss how scary this film actually is. So, is there any gore in this movie? Surprisingly enough, yes, there is a good bit of gore in here, and that's saying a lot considering this is in the MCU. But Sam Raimi has managed to actually go against some of the usual stuff that you see in other typical MCU films. There are people that die left and right, that get axed off in very gruesome ways, and the way that Sam Raimi directed these moments are cleverly handled, but you can understand what happens within that exact moment. They don't necessarily show a lot of blood and guts that you would see in a typical rated R film, but for a PG-13 movie, it's definitely in there. Even a lot more grotesque violence in here than I would say there is in The Batman. So I would say that for gore, I'm gonna be nice to this and say it deserves a 4 out of 5. I would also go the same and say that there's more torture than I expected to be in this film. Sam Raimi takes advantage of the character's Scarlet Witch and the powers that she's able to possess within this film, manages to provide some very deadly scenes that are not necessarily pleasant to watch. So for torture, I would also give that one a 4 out of 5. Now, here's where it's gonna go down a little bit. As for dread, I count dread as how the movie feels, and for the MCU, they kind of run into more of their typical formula where they tell jokes and they add in typical moments that are more so happy, filled with joy. They aren't necessarily that dreadful. So I would say there really isn't that much of dread in here, even though the story arc that's going on with Scarlet Witch and some amount with America Chavez, there's some amount of torment left inside them. So I guess for what Sam Raimi was trying to do, I'm gonna give this like a 1 out of 5. Now lastly, for brutal, it depends on what I mean by brutal, because sometimes when it comes to the kills, that can count as being brutal and that can add in some points for this category. But what should also count is the ruthlessness that's in the film. And while Scarlet Witch provides a lot of that in this movie, in the end, it still shows some amount of glee and hope, and that doesn't necessarily help out this category that much. The characters, the feeling, and the atmosphere in here would have ended more in a tragedy. And since there is some amount of reconciliation in here and some amount of redemption light in here, the brutal category is like halfway there but doesn't really reach it all the way though. So I would say for the category of brutal, it gets itself a... it just sets itself a little bit of a 3 out of 5. And with rounding up all 4 of those rating scales, in the end the suffering rating rounds itself up to a 12 out of 20. The second bracket we're going to analyze is the demon category. You gotta add in the demon category. And there are 3 different ways you can describe as demons. One could be a scary monster, or even an iconic messed up character that's in disguise but is that memorable, such as Ghostface, Michael Myers, Jason. The next one that can actually count are psychological evils that are inside of ourselves, aka our inner demons. It can actually be us. It doesn't necessarily have to look like a scary creature. It can actually be just as scary if they're a regular person, but they're insanely messed up inside. And lastly, are there any spiritual entity outside in the atmosphere, any spiritual paranormal activities that exist outside of ourselves? And now it's time to go ahead and cut back to me, who has actually seen the movie. Okay, so scary creatures, and are there any demons in this one? Yes, there are. Again, that's a big surprise, and Sam Raimi has actually decided to take in the advantage of putting in scary creatures in a MCU film. A lot of witchcraft comes into play at this because we have Scarlet Witch that's in here. Even people who are raised from the dead are in this movie, and that plays a huge pivotal role within the film. There are also other particular demons in the movie, but they don't necessarily get taken advantage of that much. But the other demons that are in the film, they do actually play a significant role in the movie. So even though it isn't a lot to the point where I could say, yes, this is terrifying, but it does take into the advantage where it is still somewhat messed up, I'm gonna go ahead and give the demon rating a 3.5 out of 5. So what about the inner demon category? Does anybody in here play that kind of role? And if you've seen the trailers for Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, yes. Clearly that has happened with Doctor Strange, and there is also indication of that happening with Scarlet Witch. And that is all I'm going to tell you, just so that I can go ahead and avoid spoilers. But I will go ahead and say this, it plays a huge role within the movie, and I think that definitely does deserve the worthy of having a 5 out of 5. Now this is an easy one to really answer. Is there any spiritual entity outside of the atmosphere? And yes, there clearly is, because Scarlet Witch, she's casting a bunch of spells, and Doctor Strange, what he does with his hands, of course he's going to get involved with some amount of spiritual entity that's outside of that. So that, it gets a 5 out of 5. So while calculating all three of the ratings for those specific details, the demon category is going to round itself up to being a 13.5 out of 15. Now we come to our third bracket within this video, and that is, does the plot revolve around something scary? And this one I find to be a little underrated, because all of the scary stuff that does happen within the plot, it's what helps get the most intense scenes in the film. So one, are there any suspenseful situations? Second, do we see any characters who have a real ambition to kill and have no motivation to stop whatsoever? And third, are our protagonists put inside traps where they barely have any room to escape, or they can't necessarily escape at all? And once again, we're cutting back to me, who has actually seen the film. So does the plot revolve around something scary? Does it carry any suspenseful situations at all? Well, there is a ton of action in here, but I don't know if that would actually count as giving this rating for suspense a high one. And that's mostly because the action in here, while it looks good in terms of a spectacle, it doesn't mean that it is as intense as, say, like the movie The Batman. And that's a movie where I had the suspense rating up a lot more higher. And the reason why I had that rating very high is because the characters and the events that happen in there are significant, and they caused a lot of change in there in terms of the characters or the future events of what would happen within the city. The story that's going on with these characters in here is fairly predictable, where you don't really feel like the suspense is much warranted. The only time where it feels like that some amount of change does happen is at the end of the movie, but that doesn't really cause as suspense. And even with that ending, I'm not necessarily sure if they're gonna go for that route for future MCU films. So for the sake of them trying a little bit, and for the action being nice to look at, I'll go ahead and give the suspense rating a 1 out of 5. So the second one, do we see any characters where their ambition is to kill and they have no motivation to stop whatsoever? And to be honest, we see one particular character in here that does have that, but in the end, they don't really get the win. And there's another character in here that you would probably say like, oh, that kind of counts. But I don't know, guys, because in the end, it was already predictable that they weren't going to win either way. So for the sake of the argument that where one person never really achieved that goal and the other person did have that ambition but didn't really win that much, I'm gonna give this rating also a 1 out of 5. Now the last thing is, are there any specific traps that characters get in and they barely have room to escape, or they didn't necessarily escape at all? And yes, there are definitely moments where characters are put in traps, or they're caught in something and they couldn't get out and they end up being killed, or sometimes they barely escaped alive. Doctor Strange is definitely in scenes where he barely felt like he got out alive, and the scenes themselves look very neat and all. However, there is this formula where you're able to predict that they can be able to get themselves out, because in the end, the MCU doesn't really feel like they want to take the risk of killing off specific characters. So there isn't really much intensity there. It's very nice to look at because the visuals in there are very appealing, and the concept of how they can get themselves out of there is still just as intriguing, but in terms of this rating to go all the way out there needs to be this implication that, well, maybe these characters really aren't going to get themselves out of this situation. So while some characters have definitely not made it out, I will give the benefit of the doubt that this rating has gone up a little bit, so I will give this one a 3.5 out of 5. And for calculating all the points within these three specific details, the rating for the plot is going to be a 5.5 out of 15. And now we cut to the most interesting part, and probably the one that you're most curious about, the jump scare factor. First of all, how many jump scares are there? Do they linger on with any kind of traumatization? I feel like that aspect is the most important to having a really good kind of jump scare, because if a jump scare is just going to leave you with a loud noise, it's not really going to be that scary. And the other thing that I want to ask is, does it leave you feeling uncomfortable? Because that's another thing that makes a jump scare a really good jump scare. Alright, and this is the final time we're going to go ahead and cut back to me, and we're going to go ahead and calculate all 4 of these brackets with their ratings and see what type of percentage this movie calculates itself up to within the scare factor. So now it's time to go ahead and jump back to me within the future one last time. Alright, now we've come to the last one, and that is the jump scare factor. How many jump scares are there? Does it leave the scene lingering with any kind of traumatization, and does it make you feel somewhat uncomfortable? First of all, there are 2 jump scares in here, and I don't think they're that impressive. I will say this, there is one scene that does make you feel a little bit unnerved, but there is a predictability where you can see where the jump scare is going to happen. As for the traumatization factor, they don't really lead into that. It's mostly just them adding in a loud sound effect, and you just get worked up for a second. These jump scares happen somewhere around in the middle of the film. I'm not going to tell you where it's at, but you can easily be able to tell when they're going to come and when that loud sound effect is going to happen. It's pretty neat to see that in an MCU film, but as a standalone film, it's nothing that great in my eyes. I will give it credit for how uncomfortable it did look in one particular scene and the creativity behind it. Just for the way that the scene looks itself, I'll give it credit for that. But for this one, I'm going to give the jump scare rating a 1.5 out of 5. So now that we've assembled every single rating from all 4 of these specific points, it's time to calculate the actual percentage of how scary Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is. And the percentage that I have calculated to is that this movie is 59% scary. So it's a little bit scarier than an average Marvel movie, but as a standalone film, I wouldn't call it that scary. So what did you guys think of Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness? Did you find the movie to be scary? Did you not find it to be scary at all and just find it to be another fun MCU film? Or did you think that it was scarier than other MCU films, or did you think that it was a legitimate scary movie? Did you agree with my rating system, or did you think that there are specific things that I should change and I should have counted them while I was grading the scare factor in the film? Put your thoughts down in the comment section below and let's have a conversation about it. And like this video if you agree with what I say, or dislike this video if you disagree with what I say. I don't mind the dislikes. So that is it I have for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll be sure to see you in the next video.